Just one more plug for the book. It should be out on Audible as an audiobook by Christmas in the next few days. So nice stocking stuffer if you want to give someone. Actually, someone said not a very Christmassy kind of gift, but I think so. If you're the right person at the right time. So hello, everybody. Last week we spoke about sort of dealing with the holiday stress and some of the issues, and I had a little bit more to talk about on that. I want to give you a very specific grounding technique that I think is really useful, that not only for Christmas stress, but for any kind of anxiety, any kind of upset, any kind of stress. But first I want to back up just slightly and rehash a little bit about some of the issues that can help us as we approach the holidays. A couple, one, so just to acknowledge our feelings, right? I think a lot of times we stifle them. There's a lot of stress and expectation with family or friends, and we have a lot of feelings. I think it's important for us to have a safe place to express those. The second is, we talked about setting limits, right? Setting limits on our commitments socially, setting limits on our spending, on our levels of activity, all those things that cause us stress, especially during the holidays. And it's really up to us to kind of set a boundary and set a limit and not go past that, because a lot of the stress we create is really unnecessary and probably of our own making. Saying no was another thing we talked about, managing expectations, taking a breather, and so on. So those are kind of the things we can do. I like brief little interventions that pack a punch. I like the breathing. We talked about 4-7-8 breathing in the past, where you inhale for 4, hold for 7, and exhale for 8. You just do that a couple cycles, and it helps basically regulate your nervous system. But today there's something else I want to talk about, and that's called 5 sense grounding, or 5 senses grounding. The concept of grounding is really important for an addict, for people that love addicts, really for anybody. The idea being that when we're stressed, we kind of fall into our defense positions, and that may include floating away, kind of dissociating, checking out, reacting, all those things. And so we basically, though, what happens is we lose touch with ourselves and with our feelings, and we feel disconnected and kind of not grounded. And so this is a specific technique for grounding that can be done really quickly. It's really effective. But to just set up the technique a little bit, it uses all 5 senses. And that's really important. I'm a hypnotherapist. When we do, like, create a safe place, for example, if someone, we want to create a safe place that they can visualize and go to in their head to kind of calm things down, I don't just say, visualize a safe place. I say, picture a safe place, so that's the visual, but then I want you to smell the fresh air, the ocean breeze, the pine trees, the fresh, clean air, whatever it may be, but to use the olfactory senses. Then to use touch, maybe you feel the soft grass underneath you, or feel the rough bark of a tree that you may be connected to, and so on. By doing that, we're taking advantage of how the brain is wired, in that we're not just using one area of the brain, but we're using all different parts of our brain where the different senses are located. And you're basically creating this network of connections that is much stronger than if I just say use one of those. If I just say picture it, that can be effective, but if you're picturing it and smelling it and tasting it and doing all the senses, it becomes much more powerful. And so that's really the basis of the technique of grounding that I wanted to talk about tonight. And it's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding. And each of the numbers is associated with a different sensation or different sense. So for example, 5 are 5 things that you see around you. And by the way, this is really could fall into the category of mindfulness exercise. It's really about bringing you right back into the present moment, and thereby grounding you and kind of getting you back connected. So 5 things you see around you. It could be a pen, a spot on the ceiling, a lamp, a speaker. It could be a stapler, anything. It just makes my brain focus on 5 things just around me in the present environment. And just, it's a conscious noticing of those. No judgment, no, gee, I need to dust that table, or gee, this or that, but to really just be present for the 5 things that you can see around you. Then the 4 things are to acknowledge 4 things that you can touch around you. So it could be your hair, you know, it could be a pillow, it could be the ground under your feet, it could be feeling the chair against your back, but it's anything that requires touch. And that's the 4 things for touch. The third are 3 things that you hear. These should be external sounds. So it could be a train horn, it could be a car, it could be the sound of a fan, it could be the sound of the TV going in another room. And interestingly, if your stomach is growling, although that's an inside sound, that counts because you're kind of hearing with your ears, not from the inside out. So 3 things that you can hear. So 5, 4, 3. We're down to 2 things that you can smell. You know, maybe in your office, maybe you can smell a pencil or a fresh blanket on your bed, or something like that, just to be aware of the olfactory sense, which, by the way, is the oldest and most powerful sense we have. It's why kids carry a blankie or a teddy bear, or why we can really get triggered sometimes with smells by addicts or reignited trauma issue. So 2 things you can smell. And finally, 1 thing you can taste. And that may be the taste inside of your mouth. Gee, did I have gum? Do I taste something I had for dinner? So it's using the taste smell as well. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's a little exercise that you can do, takes 60 seconds, but it's powerfully effective in that it really helps us detach from the stress and the activating triggers that are around us. And then we can sort of simply, in a mindful way, just be in the present moment. This is what's happening. This is what I see. This is what I taste. This is what I smell. This is what I feel. And by doing that, it's kind of a miraculous little brain trick in that it really does reorient. It distracts the worried mind, but it also provides this sense of calm in that we're just kind of back in our situation. You know, it's similar when we're doing trauma therapy, really deep trauma therapy. And when someone is activated and starts to relive the trauma or really get in a bad way, a good therapist will say, open your eyes and look at me. Let's make eye contact. And just by simply reorienting, getting back into the present moment, that calms people down. And so these are, in a sense, doing that for ourselves. Just kind of being aware, looking around, seeing what we can do, and really helping ground ourselves. So that's my little splurge thing for a 60-second grounding technique. There's a lot of them, but it falls into that category of mindfulness, as I say, which is really an important, incredibly important skill. And the more research that comes out, we see it's ever more important. But it just helps us reduce stress, stay in the moment, and really builds a lot of resilience, emotional resilience that we certainly can all use this time of year. So that's my 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 story.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. If you joined us late, I think everybody's been here from the beginning. I zapped, didn't come back. I feel terrible. Today's topic is grounding. Please ask questions about that or anything else using the Q&A feature, or you can use the chat feature. Just direct it toward the panelists so that only David and I will see your name. Otherwise, everybody will know who you are and that you're here and blah, blah, blah. Grounding is one of the things as an addict new to recovery. This is quite a while ago, but grounding was just foreign to me. I lived my life in the wreckage of my past and in the wreckage of my future. And you know, and it just had me spinning. I was either ashamed and filled with regret, or I was terrified of things that might happen. You know, for me, it had to be super. I love this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 senses because it's simple and it's straightforward, you know, and it's logical for my logical brain. You know, what are 5 things I can see? Well, I can look around and answer that question. you know, and going on down the list. But, you know, at the beginning, one of my friends, they would just poke me and say, "Where are your feet?" That's all he would say to me. And to this day, I can hear my friend Michael saying, "Where are your feet?" And I literally look down and I see that my, you know, I have, you know, my feet are in my very warm shoes on a wood floor at my desk. And oh yeah, I'm on a webinar, and it gets me back into the moment. And I think the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is probably a much better way of saying where are your feet. But you know, for me, where are my feet triggers the whole thing. But that's, you know, almost 20 years later. And so, yeah, I really love grounding techniques. Another one that I use, and I use this for myself, and I also encourage my sponsees to use it, is HALT, which is, am I hungry? Am I angry or anxious? Which is more apt to me. I'm much more likely to be anxious than angry. The L is lonely, and the T is tired. And usually if I'm feeling off, the answer to one of those questions is going to be yes. Yeah, I'm hungry. Okay, well, maybe I should have, you know, a bite of that leftover sandwich in the refrigerator. You know, if I'm tired, maybe I should just rest for 15 minutes before I get back at this, or go to bed. And if I'm lonely, maybe I should pick up the phone. And also for angry and anxious, usually I need to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. Any kind of a grounding technique, not just at the holidays, but I as a recovering addict, and I can't speak for partners, I know we have several partners on here, but as an addict, I need to ground myself at least once a day, and I've been sober for quite a while. So yeah, the more we talk about grounding, the more it sinks in. So
Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques too, and it's such a valuable, first of all, it's valuable to have the awareness that you need to ground yourself, and then to know how to do it. Because I think I was clueless. I didn't even know. I was just kind of, in my addiction, I was just floating around and bouncing and reacting all over the place without being present, really. And this is all about being present, as you said. But if you're visual, I've had friends that will visualize cords just going out of their body or their feet down into the earth, which is very solid and grounding, just a visualization of that. Or breath, and there's so many ways to use breathing, but just simply focusing on your breath, the gentle in and out, and just follow that, and then let that rhythm kind of sink in. That also is powerfully effective and easy to do. So yeah, it's really important because I think so many of us get triggered and we automatically react, and we don't have a clue about how to not react, first of all. But I think reacting, and Scott, you and I both have a lot of years in program. I still react, and I'll always react. I guess I'm human, but I know what to do now. And I can do some grounding techniques, and that's really important. Really important.
Okay, so we got a question here. I was sent here because my boyfriend has been using, it says corn, but I'm going to assume that's porn, to satisfy himself. He has been neglecting me the few times we were together, and it's caused my self-esteem to dwindle. He and I are recovering alcoholics. He's not drinking, but has multiple other addictions, pot, food, and I don't know what to do. So we feel for you. David, you want to kind of launch into that?
Yeah, thank you for attending, and I'm sorry about your situation. Yeah, I mean, you're experiencing, I guess, life with an active addict, and it's not a very pleasant place to be. The situation you describe is one that we see quite often, and that is where somebody gets sobriety or abstinence from one addiction, but the rest either blossom or you kind of transfer all that addictive impulse to others. And so, yeah, recovering alcoholics is wonderful, but if someone continues to use pot or food or sex, it's just kind of whack-a-mole with the addiction. It's the same root underneath that, but it's just being expressed in different ways. And unfortunately, you're experiencing the effects of that. And you use the word neglecting you. That, I think, is one of the hallmarks of addiction, and especially sex addiction, where the addict gets so into their addictive behavior that they're really kind of disconnected from anything but themselves and their fantasy. And partners really suffer a lot in that case. And so it's something that's problematic. I would encourage you to find really robust support for yourself. That maybe you're familiar, I assume, with 12-step meetings. There are some meetings for partners of sex addicts. There's Al-Anon and others that have some kind of practical advice and support. There are also therapists that understand these multiple addictions sometimes and will provide some help. But I think there is help out there. I would focus right now on you and getting the help that you need, and hope that he can find his way. A lot of times I think people want to jump right into couples work, and that's certainly important, but I think right now you both need to get your support systems in place. He certainly needs some assistance and maybe some kind of intervention, which may or may not be your concern, but I would certainly focus on you and any help you can get right now. It's an unfortunate position. I feel bad for you because I know it does happen a lot. And we see this a lot with people who have some experience with recovery from one addiction, but it just kind of transfers and continued impact. And I'm sure you can certainly feel that impact right now. So I guess the best advice I can say is to get support, get connections, and take care of you.
Yeah, I'm an addict with multiple addictions. I'm a sex addict, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict, and I would bounce from one to another in active addiction. And then when I got in recovery, I got into recovery for my sex addiction first, which is usually backwards. Usually people get into AA or NA, and then they realize, oh, my sex life is out of control too. I better do something about that. But my sex life was so out of control that I got there first, and it took me a couple of years to realize, oh, I have a problem with. I knew I had a problem with drugs from the beginning, but alcohol I held on to for a couple of years. But but even in the beginning, I would get sober from my sex addiction for a little while, but I'd be acting out in one of my other ones, and then I'd get sober from drugs, and I'd start drinking really heavily, and then I'd say, oh, I'm drinking too much, and I'd start acting out sexually. And my therapist at the time described it as changing seats on the Titanic. The view is different, but the ship is sinking. And he was right. And what I've come to realize is all of my addictions were about the same thing. I didn't want to feel my emotions. I was afraid of other people. I was afraid to be vulnerable. And when I was having a bad day, to call David and say, hey, David, I'm having a bad day. I was afraid he would reject me. So I would just numb out with one of my addictions so I didn't have to feel that. It sounds like that's probably what your boyfriend is doing. And as the addict, it's a miserable place to be. I would think as the partner, it's every bit as miserable to watch that and to have to deal with that. I'm glad you're here. I think David nailed it.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing. You say that it has caused your self-esteem to dwindle, and that's a very normal reaction by a partner who just can't figure out really what's going on, and in many cases it's like it's a different person. And we talked about cords before, grounding cords, but I would really encourage you to cut that cord to your partner for the time being in terms of any connection where you get any kind of self-esteem from him. Because I think if he's in his addiction, he's not going to be able to give it to you. In fact, it's quite the opposite. He's going to kind of suck it out from you indirectly. So I would really encourage you to find your self-worth and your self-esteem, and how well you can take care of yourself and what you can do for yourself, and the connections you can make based on your own recovery and a healthy thing. I think the more you attach to build on what Scott said, you're kind of jumping on board the Titanic, right? It's going down. And I think at some point, although it's painful, it's really important to kind of detach from the addict and hope they get help or push them into help. But in the meantime, like that thing on airplanes where you put the mask over yourself first, you take care of you right now. And I think there's actually the flip side of the situation is you finding your self-esteem and really taking care of yourself and growing from this.
And we hear partners all the time wondering what they did to cause this problem. And, you know, the answer is you didn't do anything to cause it. You know, your partner makes his own choices. You know, you didn't make him an addict, and you can't make him not be an addict. He has to get miserable enough that he wants the help that he needs. So, yeah, hang in there.
So there's a follow-up?
Yeah. The follow-up says, thank you. I asked him to move out because my sobriety was in jeopardy. His words do not match his actions. This is so hard, especially with the holidays. Yeah, I get it. My sponsor also, oh my God, my sponsor also just died suddenly. This is so hard. Wow, that's a lot.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's a lot. So I'd really tighten up your program right now and stay close to that and really tighten up your connections too. You need people in your lives. This time of year is tough on addicts. It's tough on anybody, frankly. But that's a lot of situational stuff that's really complicating this. So good for you for self-esteem for asking to move out. I think that's a bold statement and a necessary one. So glad you're hanging in there.
David, can you talk a little bit about what it's like to have a program of recovery? Because the person who's asked this question is clearly in recovery for alcoholism. I assume that's AA. You know, when bad things happen, you know, we have somebody to turn to that gets us. Can you talk a little about that, David?
Yeah. So things, of course, do happen all the time. I've had people that were near and dear to me die in recovery, and there's a lot of reaction to that, right? I get angry at God or disconnect, or it's easy to react in the old way, which is wasn't in a very healthy way for me. So I think to really be conscious, and by that I mean really, for me at least, it was about remaining conscious through the process. And that meant I was aware of my feelings. If I was feeling overwhelming grief, I owned it, I expressed it, I shared it with someone. If I was feeling lonely, I would talk about that as well. And that program of recovery Scott mentioned, I think, is all about this network of people, some very close to us, some maybe we recognize their face from a meeting and we don't know their name even, but there's this wide group of people at various levels of connection that is really soothing. It's like almost like we're taking our concern and sharing it with the collective, and we get some healing from that. It doesn't solve, you know, it's not magical. You're not going to have all the grief lifted, or you're not going to feel less lonely in certain situations, but you're going to feel supported and that people know what you're saying. And I guarantee you, if you express that in a meeting, you're going to help a lot of people. There will be healing in that whole meeting because other people are experiencing similar things and they may not have the courage to speak up. And they're sitting there a little bit lonely and detached. So I would encourage you to share your experience in a trusted place, like a meeting, a 12-step meeting, and don't carry this all by yourself. This is all about connection. You know, that famous quote from that TED Talk, you know, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. And so, and that goes for emotional issues too. Anytime we're in any kind of emotional pain or distress or stress, at least my reaction sometimes, it was always my reaction early on, was to kind of withdraw, to hide, to check out, to numb, to keep it a secret. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need to do. We need to get out there and talk about it. And I wish you a lot of luck. Stay close. We have webinars here every day of the week. And we'll be here through the season, except next Wednesday. My webinar anyway, but there'll be lots of others around.
David and I are taking Christmas off.
Woo!
Yay! Woo. You know, when you know, bad things still happen in life. I've been so, you know, I thought when I was this long sober, you know, my life would be perfect, and that's not how it works. The good news is I don't have to go through it alone anymore. And as an addict, I went through things alone. So sometimes I'm incredibly grateful to be an addict because it got me into recovery where I can find healthy support, which I never got from my family. And, I certainly wasn't getting from my active addict friends. I mean, I had never had healthy support, and now I do. I've had a couple of really nasty illnesses, and people go to the doctor with me. They say, "When's your next appointment?" They want to go with me, because they know that it's better to walk through it with somebody else. So,
Right.
yeah, I encourage you to really reach out to people. Ask us questions about anything. It doesn't have to be about grounding, although grounding is a great topic. But anything about your addiction, your recovery, your partner's addiction or recovery. David?
I can recap that real quick if some people joined us.
Yeah, it looks like we had some people join late. So yeah, if you want to.
Okay, so we're talking tonight about a very easy grounding technique to handle the holiday stress, to handle anxiety anytime, to handle any kind of uncomfortable feelings. And it relies on the senses, and it's something we can do easily. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And basically it's a mindfulness grounding exercise, and it's acknowledging 5 things that we see. So we're using each of our senses, 5 things we can see, like a pen, a spot, a lamp, a chair, my dog, whatever. 4 things that we can touch. So I'm holding a pen, maybe it's my computer, maybe the desk, maybe it's my fabulous cup, by the way, which is a Christmas gift for my stepdaughter, and it glows when I need a drink of water because I get lost. So that may light up, don't be shocked. 3 things you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So it really uses all those senses. And as I explained, the more senses we can use for any thought, the stronger it is because of the neural connections that are formed when we use those different senses. So it's a powerful tool.
David, when you mentioned right at the beginning that you are a hypnotherapist, and I'm always curious about what takes place in hypnotherapy and when you use it. I know that's completely off topic, but I want to know.
Yeah. So let me start. Hypnotherapy is not stage shows. It's not making people quack like a duck or do embarrassing things. Hypnotherapy works. It's a very light trance, a relaxated trance. So what that means is that if I'm in that trance, I'm totally aware of what's in the room. I'm hearing. It's like I have 1 foot in the room and 1 foot in wherever I'm working. And so the whole point of hypnotherapy is to shut off the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that filters and says, "Oh no," or "You're stupid," or "How could you do that?" or "Don't remember this." It's all that chatter, and it's simple relaxation, and it's basically we're turning off that filter so we can do work. And we do what are called regressions, which means we take people back to a time of a memory, say a disturbing memory, and do some corrective changes, mostly around conclusions they might have drawn about themselves and behaviors. So for example, if someone had an abuse scenario and they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, we might regress them to that point and say, okay, what did you conclude about yourself? I concluded that I was unsafe, that I'm unprotected, that I'm unloved, whatever those things are, and we correct those. Because what we know about trauma, we've talked about this before, but trauma creates those beliefs and behavioral decisions, by the way, too. There's not only beliefs like I feel unsafe, but it's like the decision is I'll never trust anybody again. And those things get kind of hardwired as a child grows up. And so by the time we reach adulthood, we're living our lives and we're doing our thing. But at some point in the background, we may not be aware of it. We still have that belief that I'm unlovable or I'm unsafe, or that belief that I'll never trust anybody again. So it corrects that kind of stuff. So that's a long way of answering. But hypnotherapy is just a way of allowing the brain to get quiet so that you can work with it and resolve some of the old, usually trauma. Yeah,
so that's usually an adjunct or part of trauma treatment.
Yes, it's one form of trauma therapy.
And addicts and often partners of addicts have, sometimes deep trauma histories. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so I would say almost universally, with one exception that we're seeing now, but trauma really is um, the hometown of addictive behaviors. Most addicts have a pretty extensive history of trauma, and it may range from sexual abuse, physical abuse, but there's other kinds of abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, intellectual abuse, saying, you're too stupid to go to college, or spiritual abuse. It can range with this full spectrum of disorders. And we talked also before about the more of what we call adverse childhood experiences a child has, and that can be not just trauma, but it could be the death of a parent or a sibling who's chronically ill or some kind of irregularity in the household. The more of those a child has, the greater the risk, not only for addiction, but for mental health disorders and even a shorter lifespan. So we know that these things are really significant. But if you talk to any addict, there's often usually a lot of trauma. I was speaking with our clients earlier today, and I did talk about the importance of trauma and trauma work, but it's also extremely important to time it properly so that you don't get in too deep with trauma work too soon. Because I've had clients who had therapists who were pushing them to resolve the trauma, which they needed to do, but not so soon. And they relapsed, they kept relapsing. So it's something to be aware of that's really important. But the trauma underlies most addictions. The one exception I mentioned, we're seeing this whole class now of younger men, typically young adults who are watching pornography and become addicted to porn and have all kinds of sexual dysfunction and intimacy dysfunction. And they don't necessarily have the trauma underneath that, unlike some other addicts. But trauma plays a key role. We have to pay attention to it. It's critically important, but we also need to be careful about not overloading our coping mechanisms when we're dealing with it.
Got a couple questions here. Let's skip to this one. I'm a recovering sex addict. I've been sexually sober for 2 months, sexually abstinent for 2 weeks. Yes, there is a difference between sober and abstinent, which we can deal with in a minute. I have a question concerning PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, things like anabolic steroids, SARMs, Cialis, Viagra. The question says, I've stopped using these drugs, but I wonder if these chemicals could have any effect on my addiction and how long it would take for these chemicals to leave my body. Will use of them affect my recovery? Good question.
Yeah, great question. And it's one that we encounter quite a bit. So PDE5 inhibitors are the Viagras, the Cialis, those kind of things, which are often used. But there's this whole category of kind of secondary drugs that people somehow kind of forget to include in their abstinence sometimes.
Poppers.
Yeah, poppers, and gay men use all kinds of poppers. That's one thing. I did an anonymous survey of recovery groups here among gay men, and a significant number were using poppers and considered themselves abstinent. Poppers are amyl and butyl nitrates that really are quite mood altering and often used in conjunction with sex. Anabolic steroids, testosterone, people use that. People use it for mood. I had a client once who asked his doctor to give him the pump of the steroid, the transdermal stuff he could rub in his shoulders. And when he was wanting to act out sexually, he would just, quadruple his dose to get himself all pumped up. And that's an issue as well. Cialis, poppers, I'm not sure what SARMs refers to. But yes, these things first of all, they're mood altering, except maybe with the Cialis and Viagra. However, the sensation that is associated with those drugs is certainly mood altering. And it's a way of people, we talk about the addictive ritual where people kind of get in the mindset of their addiction. And all of these things really are part of that, feeling, getting your sex drive boosted by extra testosterone, or the feeling of you get when you take a Viagra, Cialis, or all those things, poppers, they're all significant. So each one is different in terms of leaving your body. Most things clear fairly quickly. Testosterone may be a little slower. But I think it's really important to take all of those into consideration and see what's going on. Ironically, in recovery, once you kind of reset and get into your sexual recovery, you may find that you don't need those Viagras and Cialis and those drugs as well. One of the ironic side effects of sex and porn addiction and chemsex addiction is erectile dysfunction, and for both mental issues and physiological issues. But those drugs basically don't work. And so it's very frustrating. They may work for a while. People may go to injectables. It's all gets to be a big complicated game. So I'd be very cautious about them. I really applaud your awareness of this, because I think a lot of people struggle with this and understanding what it means. So I think that's an important piece to take into account. Scott, do you want to speak to the sexually sober and sexually abstinent?
Sure. Yeah. The terminology does get a little bit confused, particularly because Sex Addicts Anonymous uses the term abstinent and sobriety interchangeably. We don't tend to do that. I certainly don't. Abstinent means I'm not having any sex. It's like I'm abstinent from alcohol. I don't drink alcohol. Abstinent from sex means no sex, no masturbation, no sex with my partner, no sex. Sexually sober is a whole different animal. Sexual sobriety, we treat it the same way we treat sobriety with an eating disorder. If I'm a binge eater, well, I can't stop eating. What I can do is stop binge eating. I can stop, I can have a little sliver of cake instead of the whole cake. Sexual sobriety is, at our treatment center, Singing Integrity, we have our clients create what we call a circle plan. The inner circle is bottom line behaviors. It might be pornography and affairs and strippers and prostitutes. Those are the things that are destroying my life. And then we have like a middle boundary, which is slippery behaviors, driving through a certain neighborhood, logging on to my computer for a non-work related purpose, looking at cars can easily turn into looking at naked people. Things like that, and feelings and keeping secrets and missing a meeting and things like that, all in the middle circle. You're not losing your sobriety, but it's dangerous stuff. Watch out for it. And then we have the outer boundary, which might be, sex with my partner where we're looking into each other's eyes and talking and communicating. That would be an outer boundary sexual thing. And other outer boundaries things would be, going to the gym and having fun with my friends, things like that. So sexual sobriety, I can still have sex. I just can't do the things that were destroying my life. It's like an eating disorder. I can still eat. I just can't eat the stuff that made me weigh 450 pounds, or in that quantity. It's more of a harm reduction model, which we do not use with alcohol or drugs. Alcohol and drugs, sobriety and abstinence are the same thing. Sex, not quite. And congratulations on your 2 months sober.
Yeah. And I just looked up SARMs, by the way. It's a synthetic steroid that has less androgenic properties. So basically, same thing. I think any of these drugs are kind of used to enhance the mindset of sex. And I think, and part of the ritual, I'd be cautious about them, very cautious. In fact, I wouldn't use them personally, but we've had guys come in with years of recovery from alcohol and drugs, but we're just totally abusing testosterone for a mood altering effect, and that's a problem. So yeah, I would really be inclusive on all these things, especially if all these things are kind of related to sex and sexual image and sexual intensity. And I'd be very cautious about that because they could be very triggering. And we know part of the triggering of addiction is not just the physical piece, but it's also the mindset, the ritual, using those to kind of create a sense of self that really is more addiction based than not. So I'd be cautious.
Yeah, sex addiction is not, the goal of sex addiction is not to have an orgasm. The goal of sex addiction is to engage in this sexualized fantasy and sexualized ritual for as long as possible, because that's the high. If I'm fantasizing about sex and doing all the things that lead up to sex and, you know, preparing my little potions and ointments that, you know, enhance my sex, I am not thinking about life. I have escaped from my world. You know, the analogy we sometimes use is a cocaine addict on payday. He gets his paycheck at work, he runs out the door, goes to the bank, cashes his check, takes all that cash that he really needs to use to pay for rent and childcare and things like that, and hops in his car and zips off to his dealer's house, and doesn't notice the cop car parked across the street, and runs in, and his heart rate's elevated and he's sweaty. He's high. He is high. His brain is high. But there's no coke in the system yet. That's sex addiction. We're high before we have sex.
Right.
You know, we have an orgasm, brings our addiction to a screeching halt.
Except sometimes methamphetamine, it's so, the anticipatory effect of meth is so high, people can have an orgasm and they're still looking for the next one, even though they're physically injured from having sex for 5 days. So yeah. I wanted to mention one, I want to throw in another one that we see sometimes, that's exercise. I think sometimes a lot of guys get into kind of an exercise addiction. Now, exercise is great, and I think it's fabulous, and it's actually essential to help the brain build, to rebuild the reward circuitry that helps us with dopamine and kind of regulation. So it's important, but sometimes people can really go over the top and exercise to create that feeling that goes with that sexual hunt. And so I'd be really cautious about that too for some people.
We've got another one here. I think this is a follow-up on our first couple of questions about the alcoholic who's now acting out in sex addiction with other addictions. How do I speak to him about this? So let's make this a more general question about your partner's doing something, whether you're the addict or they're the addict, that needs to change. How do you bring that up in a healthy way and be heard? And how do you share your pain over what the other person is doing in a healthy way?
Yeah, that's, again, a tough situation. I think the first thing is to get out of a reactive mode, because so much of life around an addiction is reacting to behavior, to lies, to being gone for 4 days, you know, whatever it is. People are constantly reacting and obsessing and worrying about what's going on. I think so. We're talking today about grounding techniques. I think to be able to ground yourself in a way that you're not as reactive. And by the way, it's totally normal to be reactive, especially for the partner, because of the issues that are going on. But to really, through support, to be able to control some of that. But I found often, if you're trying to deal with an active addict, you're talking to the addiction. And I think that's a problem. We don't do treatment on people who are using. We don't try to have a serious conversation with people who are in active addiction. So I think to do real deep, meaningful talks, both people have to be present. Now, if somebody is acting out and you need to express your feelings, I think it is important to be as direct as possible. One thing I do recommend is to set an appointment. It sounds kind of artificial, but you know, look, I have something really, really important I need to talk to you about. Do I have your attention now? Or if not now, when can we have this talk? And they may or may not be able to be reliable enough to follow through, but it states the intention. And then during the talk, one stem sentence that I found really useful is, when you do X, it makes me feel Y. So it's a statement that's not all about, because oftentimes it's a conversation about you did this, you did that, and that just, everybody gets into this reactive cycle. That stem sentence, when you do X, it makes me feel Y, is a like judgment free. This is fact. This is when you act this way, it has this effect on me. And there's not much a person can do with that because you're stating your feelings and you're stating your truth. So I think to keep it simple and to not get into a long drawn out argument, that's the problem, because it's a slow process. But I certainly make yourself heard. I would try not to get into too much blame and shame, but just say, look, when you do this, it makes my self-esteem go down, or it makes me feel unloved, or it makes me feel unsafe. And by the way, remember we talked about all those feelings kids have. A lot of the stuff in an active, addictive relationship echoes those very beliefs that we have about ourselves from early on. So I would just get the support you need and get a conversation going. Keep it brief. It doesn't have to be long, but I would just state what those actions are, how they're making you feel, and then if you're clear, what you need. And sometimes that's not clear at all. It sounds simple to say, just state your needs, but I can speak as an addict, and having worked with partners, it's very cloudy sometimes and messy. People don't know what they need or want. And so that takes some clarity. But certainly I think expressing your feelings based on the consequences of a certain behavior, that's what needs to happen.
It can also be difficult to know what you're feeling. Sometimes you have to get some coaching on figuring out what you're feeling.
Yeah.
Because anger is it's a feeling, but it's never the root feeling.
Right. So, and then I always ask clients if they're feeling anger to drop down underneath, and what you almost always find is either fear or hurt or loneliness or some kind of core feeling that's there. But yeah, I think it might be useful to get a professional to help you with this. There are couples therapists that do this kind of work, although most therapists are going to be, I think, reluctant to work with somebody who's in active addiction, although there are interventionists that certainly do that. But again, focus on yourself the best you can and state your needs clearly and simply. But it takes time. And I think sometimes when we have those very meaningful conversations where we lay it out, we expect some result, and we're often disappointed, at least initially. It takes time to unfold. So wish you the best of luck with that.
Yeah. This next question, and we get variations of this question a lot. How do you know how to have intimacy with your sex or porn addicted partner and have that intimacy not be part of the addiction? And then it goes on to say, he will have sex with me and then I'll catch him in the bathroom afterward looking at porn on his iPad. How do you separate the addiction from actual relational intimacy?
Right. Again, that's a complicated topic. That requires time as well. I think oftentimes sex and porn addicts and chemsex addicts, for that matter, have this, it has an effect on relationships that really distance them, where partners are kind of disconnected, sexual partners become objectified, usually not anyone you have an emotional connection with. So kind of love and lust become separated. And I think sometimes when you have someone in addiction who's also trying to be intimate, it gets very confused and confusing. What I recommend to clients, because addiction, and I was just talking this earlier today with our friends at the house, addiction is all about, it lives in the head. It's all about scripts and fantasies and thoughts and scenarios, to the point where you start to disconnect. You may be having sex with a person, but that person is kind of an object in the fantasy that's rolling in your head. So there's a disconnect there. What I encourage couples to do is to drop down out of their heads and get into feelings and sensations and really do this a mindfulness process. You can even do the grounding, 5 sense grounding thing we talked about, to kind of just be in the moment. And that's hard. It's hard for an addict, hard for partners too, because being intimate is scary. Being intimate, truly intimate, means you're vulnerable. It means your feelings are right out and open. And that's something that most addicts don't ever want to be close to. So it takes practice, it takes trust on both parts. And I know the trust is a huge issue for partners as well. But I think to really focus on sensations, feelings, sensations and touch, and keep it at a physical level and in the moment. But otherwise, it's just hard and very confusing, I think, for you and for everyone.
Yeah, I want to address the other part of that, which is having sex and then going into the bathroom and looking at porn on the iPad. That is total sex addict behavior. I did that. I would have sex, and then I would, usually with the prostitute, and I would drive the prostitute back to wherever I picked that individual up, and wouldn't even make it home before I was cruising looking for another prostitute. Or if I did make it home, I went right to the computer and was looking at porn. That's when the modem was still screechy and things loaded, But that's a very sex addict behavior, and again, I said earlier, sex addiction is not about the sex; it's about the escape, and it's just one to another. It's like a heroin addict, continuing to shoot up after he's been high for 3 days, or a meth addict. Meth addicts go on huge benders, don't they, David?
Oh yeah, days worth of benders, and I've had many clients.
No sleep, no food.
No sleep, no food, no water. Many times I'll hear a meth addict talk about, having sex, being literally, physically having sex with someone and on their phone looking for the next hookup. That's not unusual. So, and that's all about this dopamine rush. So when you're dealing with somebody like that who's in and out of their addiction, they're being intimate with you and then in their addiction, I think that's a time for real clear boundaries and maybe a separation, not a marital separation, but some kind of boundaries where there's some time until that person can learn to differentiate their behavior from real intimate and connective behavior.
And one of the things I'll add here, we're kind of running out of time, but when people come into treatment for sex addiction, we talked about the difference between sobriety and abstinence. One of the first things we tell them is you're going to be abstinent while you're here, and we'd like you to commit to 30 or 60 days, because they need to clear their head a little bit, and it's just, sex gets in there and it just spins, and we can't tell what's part of the addiction and what's not part of the addiction. When we're active in it, we just have no idea. We can't see it. It's very confusing. There were things that I thought were fine that were not fine, and there were things that I thought were problematic that were not problematic, but I needed distance and clarity to see which parts of my life, and that goes, it takes time for the parts of the brain, and David can address this better than I can, to sort of clear up and heal a little bit.
Right. And remember also with addiction, the number of neural pathways between the deep emotional part of the brain, which fuels addiction, and our prefrontal cortex, which is where we make good decisions, those get frayed. So basically we're at the mercy of our emotional self without good controls on the behavior. And that's classic addiction. And that's actually a physical brain issue too, that comes with addiction. So there's a lot of behaviors that are just, unacceptable, but sometimes the addict has a hard time differentiating that. As Scott just said, normal versus unnormal, not to excuse it, but it's a matter of clarity that needs time to kind of let the dust settle.
And that kind of brings us back to today's actual topic of grounding, which is one of the best ways to sort of heal those pathways, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I'll recap that real quickly. So grounding today, talked about a mindfulness. It's really a mindfulness practice, and it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We talked about hypnotherapy. I know in hypnotherapy, when I do it, if you're trying to do an image, like a safe place, you want to incorporate all the senses so that that image is strengthened. So if I ask people not only to picture, but to smell the air, to feel the grass on their tush if they're sitting out, or to taste wonderful food, to really make it become three-dimensional. So this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is acknowledge 5 things you see around you, 4 things you can touch around you, 3 things you can hear right now, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And it's a really a beautiful, simple practice of just re-anchoring myself right here in the moment.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just a reminder, next Wednesday is Christmas. David and I are taking that one off, but we will be here the following week on New Year's Day. So please join us.
Yep.
And we'll see you then.
Thank you, Scott. And happy holidays, everyone.